The strange thing about rock bottom is that sometimes it doesn't look like failure at all. Sometimes it looks like a woman in a $2,000 coat, standing in the rain with nowhere left to go. The storm rolled across western Pennsylvania like a dark ocean in the sky. Rain hammered the empty highway. Wind rattled loose signs along the roadside. And beneath the glow of a flickering gas station light, Mason Reed wiped grease from his hands and prepared to close his garage for the night. It had been a long Thursday. 3 brake jobs, 1 transmission repair, a customer who still owed him $400. The scent of motor oil lingered in the air while thunder rolled somewhere beyond the hills. Mason checked the clock. Nearly 9:30 p.m. His daughter Abby would already be waiting at home, probably curled up on the couch with a book she was supposed to be asleep instead of reading. A faint smile crossed his face. She was the reason he kept going. The reason every exhausting day still felt worth surviving. He reached for the garage door chain when headlights suddenly appeared through the rain. A black luxury sedan pulled into the parking lot. The engine sputtered once, then died. Mason sighed quietly. Another late-night breakdown. The driver's door opened. A woman stepped out. For a moment, she simply stood there beneath the rain, not moving, not speaking. Her chestnut brown hair clung to her face. Her expensive coat was soaked through. Even from 30 feet away, Mason could see something unusual in her expression. Not fear, not anger, exhaustion, the kind that sleep couldn't fix. She approached slowly. Her heels clicked against the wet pavement before sinking into a puddle. Mason waited. "Looks like your alternator might be gone," he said. "I can take a look tomorrow morning." The woman nodded but didn't answer. Rainwater dripped from her sleeves. Thunder growled overhead. For several seconds neither of them spoke. Then she looked up. Her green eyes were red from crying. "I know this sounds crazy," she whispered. Mason frowned slightly. "What does?" Another gust of wind swept across the lot. The woman wrapped her arms around herself. Her voice was barely audible. "Can I sleep in your car tonight?" The words hit Mason harder than he expected. He froze. Not because the request was inappropriate. Not because he felt threatened. But because nothing about her made sense. Her clothes suggested wealth. Her watch probably cost more than his pickup truck. Yet here she stood asking a stranger for a place to sleep. Rain drummed against the metal roof. Somewhere in the distance a train horn echoed through the darkness. Mason studied her face. Whatever story had brought her here was bigger than a broken car. Bigger than a storm. Bigger than anything she was willing to say. "You don't have family?" he asked gently. She looked away. "Not tonight." "Friends?" A sad smile touched her lips. "Not anymore." The answer lingered between them. Quiet. Heavy. Honest. Mason glanced toward his old SUV parked beside the garage. Then back at the woman standing alone beneath the rain. Every instinct told him there was something she wasn't saying. But another instinct, the one that had guided him ever since becoming a father, told him something else. Sometimes people didn't need answers first. Sometimes they just needed kindness. He exhaled slowly. "My name's Mason." The woman swallowed. "Rachel." "Well, Rachel," he said softly, reaching into his pocket for the keys. "Let's get you out of the rain." Neither of them knew it yet, but that simple decision would become the first step toward a story neither one of them could have imagined. The rain continued through most of the night, tapping softly against the roof of the old SUV parked beside Mason's garage. Rachel sat quietly in the passenger seat with the blanket he had given her folded around her shoulders. The vehicle smelled faintly of motor oil, pine-scented air freshener, and years of hard work. It was not comfortable by most standards, but for the first time in weeks, she felt safe. Across town, Mason pulled into the driveway of his small white house just after 10 o'clock. A warm porch light glowed through the darkness. Before he even reached the front door, it swung open. Abby stood there in oversized pajamas, her brown hair slightly messy from staying awake too late. "You are late," she said, crossing her arms dramatically. Mason smiled. "I know. Did another customer forget how cars work?" she asked. "Something like that." Abby narrowed her eyes. "That means yes." Inside, the house smelled like cinnamon tea and the blueberry muffins they had baked the previous weekend. It was small, worn around the edges, but filled with a kind of warmth money could never manufacture. Mason tucked Abby into bed a few minutes later, but as he turned off the lamp, she noticed something unusual. "You look worried." Mason paused. "Do I? You always rub your neck when you are worried." He laughed softly. Maybe there is someone having a rough night. Abby thought for a moment. Did you help them? I tried. Then you should not worry. Children sometimes had a way of simplifying truths adults spent years complicating. The next morning, the storm had passed. Sunlight spilled across the town. Mason arrived at the garage just before 7. As he unlocked the door, he glanced toward the SUV. Rachel was already awake. She sat quietly with a paper cup of coffee from the gas station across the road. Her eyes looked less tired than the night before, but only slightly. Morning, Mason said. Morning. For a few seconds, neither spoke. Then Rachel reached into her purse. I can pay you. Mason shook his head immediately. No, you do not even know me. I know enough. Rachel lowered her eyes. Most people in her world always wanted something. A favor, a contract, access, recognition. Yet this mechanic kept refusing every opportunity to gain from her situation. Before she could respond, another voice suddenly called out. Dad. Mason turned. Abby was running across the parking lot carrying a paper bag almost as big as she was. Rachel looked surprised. You brought your daughter? School starts later today, Mason explained. Abby stopped in front of Rachel and held out the bag. I brought breakfast. Rachel blinked. For me? Abby nodded. Dad said you had a bad night. Inside the bag was a homemade muffin, a banana, and a small note written in colorful marker. Rachel unfolded it carefully. The message contained only 6 words. Hope today is better than yesterday. Rachel stared at the note. For a moment, she could not speak. Somewhere deep inside her, behind boardrooms, quarterly reports, private jets, and endless pressure, something small and forgotten began to stir. It felt suspiciously like hope. Rachel remained at the garage longer than she intended. At first she told herself it was only because her car needed repairs. Then she blamed the weather. Then the lack of options. But deep down, she knew the truth was something else entirely. By mid-morning, sunlight streamed through the open garage doors while Mason worked beneath the hood of her sedan. The metallic sounds of tools clicking against engine parts echoed through the building. Rachel sat quietly at a small desk near the office window, holding the note Abby had given her earlier. She had read those 6 words at least 20 times. Hope today is better than yesterday. Such a simple sentence. Yet somehow it carried more sincerity than most conversations she had experienced in years. Across the room, Abby colored pictures while waiting for school to begin. Every few minutes, she glanced toward Rachel as if checking whether she was smiling yet. Finally, she walked over holding a sheet of paper. This is for you too. Rachel accepted it carefully. The drawing showed 3 people standing beside a garage under a bright yellow sun. One figure had long brown hair. Another wore coveralls. The third was a little girl holding both their hands. Rachel stared at the picture. Who are they? Abby shrugged. People who are not lonely anymore. Rachel felt something tighten in her chest. She quickly looked away. Mason noticed, but said nothing. He simply returned to his work. That was another thing she was beginning to realize about him. He never pushed. He never demanded explanations. He offered kindness the way some people offered coffee. Quietly, without expecting repayment. Around noon, Mason wiped his hands on a shop towel. Good news. The car should be running by tomorrow. Rachel nodded. Thank you. A brief silence followed. Then Mason leaned against the workbench. You said you lost your job. Rachel hesitated. Yes. It was not entirely true, but it was close enough to the version of reality she could manage. That must have been hard. She laughed softly. You have no idea. Mason studied her expression. Maybe not. But everybody loses something eventually. Rachel looked at him. What did you lose? For the first time, Mason became quiet. The garage suddenly seemed smaller. The air felt heavier. My wife, he said gently. 7 years ago. Rachel immediately regretted asking. I am sorry. Mason nodded. Me too. He glanced toward Abby. But life keeps moving. Sometimes you keep moving with it. Sometimes your kid drags you along. Abby looked up from her coloring book. I heard that. Mason smiled. Rachel found herself smiling too. It was small, barely noticeable, but it was real. Outside, traffic rolled past on the highway. The afternoon sun warmed the pavement. Somewhere beyond the garage walls, investors were searching for her. Lawyers were making calls. Executives were holding emergency meetings. Yet for a few unexpected hours, none of it existed. Rachel Morgan sat in a small-town garage with a mechanic and his daughter, pretending to be someone else. And for the first time in a very long time, She did not want the lie to end. That evening, the sky turned the color of amber glass as the sun settled behind the rolling hills outside town. Mason locked the garage and gathered his tools while Abby finished her homework at the small desk near the office window. Rachel stood beside her repaired sedan, holding the keys Mason had just handed back to her. "It is running perfectly," she said. "Thank you." Mason nodded. "It should last a long time now." Rachel looked at the car, then at the highway beyond it, then back at Mason. She should have left. Every logical part of her mind knew that. Yet the thought of returning to her old life felt strangely exhausting. "You have somewhere to go?" Mason asked gently. Rachel hesitated. "Not really." The answer slipped out before she could stop it. Mason studied her face for a moment. He saw the same thing he had noticed the night before. Not helplessness, not weakness, just a person carrying more weight than anyone should carry alone. Before he could respond, Abby suddenly appeared between them. "Dad." Mason looked down. "Yeah." "Invite her." Mason blinked. "Abby, you always tell me people matter more than plans." Rachel lowered her eyes, embarrassed. Abby continued anyway. "And she looks like she needs dinner." Mason rubbed the back of his neck. Abby had inherited an unfortunate habit of speaking uncomfortable truths at exactly the wrong moment. Or perhaps exactly the right one. 20 minutes later, Rachel found herself sitting at the small kitchen table inside the Reed home. The scent of roasted chicken and fresh biscuits filled the air. A baseball game played quietly on an old television in the living room. The house was modest. The paint around the windows needed touching up. One kitchen chair wobbled slightly whenever someone leaned back too far. Yet everything felt alive, warm, real. Abby talked almost nonstop while Mason prepared dinner. She spoke about school, books, science projects, and a stray cat she was determined to adopt despite her father's repeated objections. Rachel listened. At first, she only smiled politely. Then she laughed. Then she found herself contributing to the conversation. For nearly an hour, she forgot who she was supposed to be. The meal ended, but nobody rushed away from the table. Outside, crickets chirped beneath the evening stars. The kitchen lights cast a soft golden glow across the room. Abby eventually disappeared upstairs to finish getting ready for bed. The house grew quieter. Rachel wrapped both hands around a mug of tea. "I forgot what this feels like," she admitted softly. Mason looked up. "What?" Rachel glanced around the room. The photographs on the walls. The stack of library books. The worn wooden table. Being somewhere nobody wants anything from you. Silence settled gently between them. Mason understood more than she realized. "Sometimes the world gets loud," he said. "You spend so much time trying to keep up that you forget who you are." Rachel stared into her tea. His words landed deeper than he could have known. For months, she had been surrounded by people. Thousands of employees, investors, advisors, reporters. Yet she had never felt more alone. A floorboard creaked upstairs. Abby's bedroom. Door closed. The house became still. Rachel blinked quickly and looked away toward the dark window above the sink. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "I am tired, Mason. Not physically tired. Not from travel or stress. Something deeper. Something older." Mason did not offer advice. He did not ask questions. He simply nodded. And for reasons Rachel could not explain, that simple act of understanding nearly brought tears to her eyes. The next morning arrived wrapped in a calm that felt almost fragile. Sunlight spilled through the kitchen windows while Abby rushed through breakfast before school. Rachel sat quietly at the table with a cup of coffee, watching a life that seemed impossibly simple and impossibly precious at the same time. Mason packed Abby's lunch. Abby searched for a missing homework folder. The old clock above the refrigerator ticked steadily. It was ordinary, yet Rachel found herself wishing the morning would never end. After dropping Abby at school, Mason and Rachel returned to the garage. The town moved at its usual pace. Pickup trucks rolled past. Customers stopped in for oil changes. A retired farmer spent 20 minutes talking about fishing. Rachel helped organize paperwork in the office simply to stay busy. Around noon, Mason stepped outside carrying a box of parts that had just been delivered. He was halfway across the parking lot when he noticed 3 black luxury SUVs turning slowly onto the service road. The vehicles were spotless, expensive, out of place. They moved with purpose. One after another, they pulled into the lot. Mason stopped walking. The engines shut off. Doors opened almost simultaneously. Several professionally dressed men stepped out and scanned the area. Their expressions were serious, controlled, focused. Inside the office, Rachel saw them through the window. The color drained from her face. Her coffee cup froze halfway to the desk. For a moment, nobody moved. Then one of the men spotted her. Relief flooded his features. He hurried toward the office entrance. "Ms. Morgan." The words carried across the garage. Mason looked up. Rachel closed her eyes briefly. The secret she had carefully protected was gone. The office door opened. The man stepped inside. "We have been searching for you for 4 days." Rachel stood slowly. "I know. The board is demanding answers. The media is reporting your disappearance. Investors are panicking." Silence settled over the room. Mason remained near the doorway. He did not interrupt. He simply listened. The man lowered his voice. "The company needs you." Rachel glanced toward Mason, then toward the garage, then toward the quiet life she had borrowed for a few precious days. "I need a minute," she said softly. Outside, a warm breeze stirred across the parking lot. The distant sound of children playing drifted from a nearby school field. Rachel stepped out of the office. Mason waited beside the garage door. Neither spoke immediately. Finally, he asked, "Morgan?" Rachel nodded. "Rachel Morgan." Mason recognized the name instantly. Morgan Automotive Group was one of the largest automotive companies in America. Television interviews, magazine covers, billion-dollar manufacturing contracts. Suddenly, everything made sense. The expensive clothes, the guarded answers, the exhaustion hidden behind confidence. Rachel looked away. "I should have told you." Mason shrugged gently. "You were not ready." Her eyes glistened. "Most people react differently when they find out." Mason folded his arms. "You are still the same person who drank coffee in my kitchen." For a second, Rachel could not speak. Then she smiled sadly. It might have been the most honest smile she had shown anyone in years. Moments later, she walked toward the waiting SUVs. The men opened the doors. The engine started. Before getting inside, she looked back one last time. Mason stood quietly beside the garage. The afternoon sun illuminated the dust floating through the air around him. No anger, no disappointment, just dignity. Then the convoy pulled away, and for the first time since Rachel Morgan entered his life, the garage felt strangely empty. 3 days passed, yet Rachel's absence lingered inside the Reed household like a song that refused to leave. Abby still asked about her every evening. Mason always gave the same answer. "She is probably busy." But even he knew the explanation sounded weaker each time he said it. Life returned to its familiar rhythm. The garage opened at 7 every morning. Customers came and went. Oil stains appeared on the concrete floor. Parts catalogs piled up on the counter. Yet something felt different. On Friday afternoon, Mason was replacing a damaged fuel pump when the television mounted in the waiting area suddenly caught his attention. A breaking news banner stretched across the screen. The face that appeared beneath it made him stop turning his wrench. Rachel Morgan stood behind a podium surrounded by reporters. Flashing cameras illuminated the stage. Her expression was composed, but Mason immediately recognized the exhaustion hidden behind her eyes. Morgan Automotive Group faces mounting pressure as shareholders question leadership during an ongoing internal investigation, the news anchor reported. Chief Executive Officer Rachel Morgan returned this week after a brief, unexplained disappearance. Mason frowned. Internal investigation. The phrase stayed with him. The report continued. Several board members appeared on screen. Then another executive took the podium. Derek Vaughn. His expensive suit was flawless. His smile looked professional. Yet something about him felt wrong. "The company remains stable," Derek said confidently. "We are evaluating all available options to protect shareholder interests." Mason watched carefully. Years of running a small business had taught him something important. Sometimes people revealed more through what they did not say than what they actually said. Derek kept talking about stability, control, leadership, transitions, future opportunities. Not once did he mention Rachel by name. Across the garage, a customer shook his head. Corporate people. Mason returned to work, but the story stayed in the back of his mind. That evening, he picked Abby up from school. As they drove home, she stared out the passenger window. "Do you think Rachel is okay?" Mason glanced at her. "I hope so." Abby nodded slowly. She looked happier here. The statement hit harder than Mason expected. Later that night, after Abby had gone to bed, Mason sat alone in the kitchen with a cup of coffee. Rain tapped softly against the windows. The television played quietly in the background. Another business segment appeared. Another report about Morgan Automotive. This time the story focused on one of the company's manufacturing divisions. Production delays, equipment failures, missing quality reports. The details were technical. Most viewers probably ignored them. Mason did not. He leaned forward. Certain terms sounded familiar. Certain explanations did not make sense. As a mechanic, he spent every day diagnosing machines. Machines rarely lied. Data rarely lied. People sometimes did. He grabbed a notepad from the counter and began writing. One report became 2, then 3. The inconsistencies multiplied. By midnight, several pages covered the kitchen table. Mason rubbed his tired eyes. The deeper he looked, the stranger everything seemed. Outside, thunder rolled across the distant hills. Inside, a quiet realization settled over him. Rachel was not simply dealing with a difficult board meeting. Someone inside her company was hiding something. And for the first time since she left town, Mason felt a growing certainty that she might need help far more than she realized. The following Monday began before sunrise. A layer of fog rested over the highway while Mason unlocked the garage and switched on the fluorescent lights. Most mornings started with repair orders and coffee. This morning started with a decision. The stack of notes he had assembled over the weekend sat on the corner of his workbench. Production reports, equipment records, public filings. None of it belonged in the hands of a small-town mechanic. Yet the more he reviewed the information, the more certain he became that something inside Morgan Automotive Group was deeply wrong. By mid-morning, another news report appeared on television. Rachel stood before a room full of shareholders. Her posture remained confident, but the pressure showed in her eyes now. Questions came rapidly. Concerns about profits, delays, missing documentation. The camera briefly shifted toward Derek Vaughn. Unlike Rachel, he looked completely comfortable. Almost too comfortable. Mason narrowed his eyes. Experience had taught him that honest people usually looked concerned when problems appeared. Derek looked prepared. That afternoon, Abby arrived at the garage after school carrying her backpack and a paper bag of snacks. She immediately noticed the notes spread across Mason's desk. "You are working on Rachel's stuff again." Mason smiled. "Maybe." Abby climbed onto a stool. "Then you should call her." Mason laughed softly. "I do not exactly have the phone number of a billionaire chief executive officer." Abby thought for a moment. "She gave you her business card." Mason froze. Abby pointed toward a drawer. The shiny one. A minute later, Mason stared at the card Rachel had left behind during her stay. He had forgotten about it completely. The silver lettering reflected the afternoon sunlight. Rachel Morgan, Chief Executive Officer. Direct contact information. For several seconds, he simply looked at it. Then he picked up the phone. Hours later, more than 200 miles away, Rachel sat alone inside a conference room on the 42nd floor of Morgan Automotive headquarters. The city skyline stretched beyond the glass walls. Evening sunlight reflected from neighboring towers. The room felt enormous. Empty. Exhausting. Another board meeting had ended. Another argument. Another accusation. Several directors openly questioned her leadership. Others quietly avoided eye contact altogether. Worst of all, the investigation continued producing evidence that somehow always seemed to damage her position while strengthening Derek's influence. Her phone vibrated. An unfamiliar number appeared. Normally, she would have ignored it. For reasons she could not explain, she answered. Rachel speaking. A familiar voice responded. "I think I found something." She immediately sat upright. "Mason, I have been reviewing the manufacturing reports from the news coverage." Silence followed. Then Rachel laughed softly in disbelief. "You have been doing what?" "Looking at the equipment failure claims." His voice remained calm. "Practical. Certain. The numbers do not match." Rachel's expression changed. "Explain." For the next 10 minutes, Mason carefully walked through every inconsistency he had discovered. Production failures attributed to equipment that should not have been capable of causing those specific defects. Maintenance schedules that contradicted public statements. Reports that appeared technically impossible. Rachel listened without interrupting. The deeper he went, the quieter she became. Finally, she whispered, "Oh my God." Mason stopped. "What?" Rachel slowly stood from her chair. For the first time in weeks, something felt different. Not fear. Not pressure. Hope. "Those reports are the foundation of the entire investigation," she said. "And if you are right, Someone manufactured the evidence. Outside her office window, the city lights began flickering on one by one. Inside the conference room, Rachel realized that the person who might save her company was not a famous attorney, an elite consultant, or a powerful investor. It was the mechanic who once gave a stranger a safe place to rest during a storm. 2 days later, Mason Reed found himself standing inside a building that seemed to belong to another world. Glass walls stretched toward the ceiling. Marble floors reflected the morning sunlight. Executives hurried through hallways carrying tablets and briefing folders. Nobody noticed the mechanic in worn work boots holding a simple leather binder beneath his arm. Rachel met him near a private elevator. For a moment, neither spoke. Then she smiled. It was the same genuine smile she had worn in his kitchen. "Thank you for coming." Mason shrugged. "You sounded like you needed help." Rachel looked at him carefully. "You have no idea how much." Together, they entered the executive conference floor. Inside the boardroom, tension filled the air like humidity before a storm. 12 board members sat around a polished table. Attorneys occupied one side of the room. Financial advisors occupied the other. At the far end sat Derek Vaughn. His expression remained calm, but his eyes narrowed slightly when he noticed Mason. One board member adjusted his glasses. "Rachel, we are prepared to continue." Another looked toward Mason. "And who exactly is this?" Before Rachel could answer, Derek laughed softly. "I was wondering the same thing." Several people turned toward Mason. Expensive suits, elite educations, corporate titles. The room practically radiated authority. "This is Mason Reed," Rachel said. "He identified discrepancies in the investigation data." Derek leaned back in his chair. "A mechanic identified them?" A few quiet chuckles followed. Mason did not react. Years of life had taught him that insecurity often arrived disguised as confidence. Derek folded his hands. "With respect, Rachel, our company employs engineers, analysts, consultants, and attorneys. Yet somehow we are now taking advice from a small-town repairman." The room grew uncomfortable. Rachel opened her mouth to respond, but Mason gently raised a hand. "May I?" The chairman nodded. Mason stepped toward the presentation screen. His movements remained calm, measured, unhurried. "I repair machines every day," he began. "And machines tell the truth if you know how to listen." The room became slightly quieter. Mason opened his binder. One report appeared on the screen. Then another. Then another. He carefully explained each inconsistency. Production failures blamed on equipment incapable of producing those defects. Maintenance records altered after inspections occurred. Data sets copied and reused across separate facilities hundreds of miles apart. Every explanation was simple, clear, undeniable. The attorneys stopped taking notes. The consultants stopped checking their phones. Board members leaned forward. 20 minutes passed. Then 30. The confidence slowly disappeared from Derek's face. "That proves nothing," he finally interrupted. Mason looked at him calmly. "Actually, it proves someone manipulated the investigation." Silence followed. Mason clicked to the final slide. A timestamp appeared, then a digital authorization trail, then a list of approvals. Every path led to the same executive office. Derek's office. Nobody spoke. Not immediately. Not for several long seconds. The chairman stared at the screen. One director removed her glasses. Another slowly closed his folder. Rachel watched the room transform in real time. The accusations aimed at her vanished. The assumptions vanished. The doubt vanished. Truth had entered the room, and truth had a way of demanding silence. Derek attempted to speak again, but nobody was listening anymore. For the first time since the crisis began, every eye turned toward Rachel. And for the first time in weeks, hope returned to her face. 6 months later, autumn returned to western Pennsylvania. Golden leaves drifted across the highway outside Mason's garage. The crisis at Morgan Automotive had become national news. Independent investigators confirmed the manipulation of internal reports. The board unanimously restored its confidence in Rachel's leadership. Investors returned. Employees kept their jobs. The company survived. Yet none of those victories felt as important to Rachel as the memory of a small kitchen table, a homemade muffin, and a little girl who had written 6 simple words on a piece of paper. Life at the garage continued much as it always had. Mason still arrived before sunrise. Abby still filled every room with questions and laughter. The old coffee machine still made terrible coffee. Some things never changed. On a cool Saturday afternoon, Mason was replacing brake pads when a familiar sound rolled into the parking lot. He looked up. A black SUV stopped near the entrance. For a moment, he simply stared. Then the driver's door opened. Rachel stepped out. No reporters. No assistants. No security team. Just Rachel. Her chestnut hair moved gently in the autumn breeze. A smile touched her face as she walked toward the garage. Mason set down his wrench. "You are back." Rachel laughed softly. "That is a very small reaction for someone who has not seen me in 6 months." Mason shrugged. "I had a feeling you would show up eventually." Before Rachel could answer, the office door burst open. Abby came running across the garage. "Rachel." A second later, she wrapped her arms around her. Rachel hugged her tightly and closed her eyes. Some reunions felt loud. This one felt like home. An hour later, the three of them sat outside beneath a sky painted orange and gold by the setting sun. The garage was closed. The highway traffic had thinned. Crickets had begun their evening song. Rachel held a cup of coffee while Abby talked about school, science fairs, and a stray cat that had finally won permission to stay. Eventually, Abby disappeared inside to finish a project, leaving Mason and Rachel alone. A comfortable silence settled between them, the kind that only existed between people who no longer needed to impress each other. Rachel looked toward the horizon. "You know," she said quietly, "the night I arrived here, I thought my life was falling apart." Mason listened. "Maybe it had to." Rachel smiled. "Maybe." The breeze stirred fallen leaves across the pavement. The fading sunlight reflected in the garage windows. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Rachel turned toward him. Her expression carried none of the confidence she used in boardrooms, none of the authority that managed a billion-dollar company. Only honesty. "The first question I ever asked you changed my life." Mason remembered immediately. The storm, the rain, the exhausted woman standing alone. Rachel took a slow breath. Then she asked a second question. "Mason, can I come home with you?" The world did not erupt into applause. No dramatic music appeared. No crowd gathered to celebrate. Something far more beautiful happened. The evening grew completely still. Mason smiled. Abby watched from the office window with a grin so wide it almost hurt. And beneath the quiet autumn sky, 3 lonely lives finally became one family.